Welcome to VSOW, which, for us, is shorthand for Value So Wisdom. This is where we dig into dense, often complex source material.
And we try to pull out the actionable insights, really looking at the gap between what policies say they'll do and, well, what actually happens on the ground.
Today, we are taking on a really significant deep dive. We're looking at systemic failures across American policy.
Yeah, our mission, if you will, is to understand that huge, sometimes catastrophic difference between the promise of our institutions, judicial, political, economic, and the actual delivery.
And we're using some powerful analytical tools here, things like destructive creation from economics.
And this really interesting rhetorical concept called the perversity thesis. We'll unpack those.
You've got a pretty diverse stack of sources today, designed to really test these ideas across different fields.
That's right. We have hard economic data looking at the criminal justice system and how it impacts wealth.
Then there's historical analysis, going back to the progressive era and its whole push for scientific efficiency.
We're also diving into political game theory, specifically how it's being applied to trade policy right now.
And underpinning it all are some core philosophical critiques about the very nature of reform itself.
The thread tying all this together from, say, court fees impacting a family to global trade strategy is this idea of systems ending up doing the exact opposite of what they were set up for.
So how does trying to achieve order or justice or even efficiency sometimes lead to, well, more inequality, more chaos, and less stability?
That's the core question.
And to ground this, make it really tangible, we're starting with maybe the most immediate modern crisis: the economic fallout from America's massive criminal legal system.
Specifically how it functions as a system of wealth stripping. This isn't just about punishment in the moment.
No, it's about creating long-term, persistent financial instability.
Okay, so first, the scale. The sheer number of people interacting with the criminal legal system in the U.S. is, well, it's almost unimaginable. It's the result of decades of focus on mass incarceration, hypercriminalization.
The sources are estimating somewhere between 70 million and 100 million Americans.
That's right, 70 to 100 million, which is, roughly 1 in 3 adults in the country.
1 in 3. Carrying some kind of record could be incarceration, a conviction, even just an arrest.
Exactly. And when you see a number like that, you realize this isn't some fringe issue. It's not just impacting a small group.
No, it's become a fundamental structural feature of American life today.
And the analysis we looked at from the Center for American Progress really drives home the intergenerational aspect. They estimate nearly half of all kids in the U.S. now have at least one parent with that kind of record.
Wow. So the stigma, the disadvantage, it's literally being passed down. It becomes this nationwide crisis.
And that stigma gets weaponized, economically speaking. These immediate and long-lasting economic hits are often called collateral consequences.
And in our digital world, that record follows you everywhere. Something like 9 out of 10 U.S. employers use criminal background checks when they're hiring.
9 in 10. So that record becomes an active structural barrier. It physically blocks access to stable jobs, especially well-paying ones.
Let's quantify that cost, the cost of being excluded. One major study found that people who were formerly incarcerated see their lifetime earnings cut by an average of 52%.
52%, over half their potential earnings gone, just because of that record, that systemic exclusion.
And if you add that up, across the country, the sources estimate Americans with criminal convictions lose out on wages exceeding $372 billion every single year.
Think about that number, $372 billion, just stripped out of the economy, mostly from households that were likely struggling already.
And that money isn't just vanishing. It's lost consumption, lost investment potential, lost tax revenue for communities.
And it gets worse because on top of the lost wages, you have this huge issue of criminal justice debt.
The fines and fees.
Exactly. Court-imposed fines, fees, restitution, all sorts of monetary sanctions. These can pile up incredibly fast, thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars.
Which just traps people, right? It creates this cycle where they can't possibly get out of financial precarity.
Yeah.
It destroys a family's ability to save, to invest, or even just handle a small emergency. Hashtag, tag 1.2 incarcerations direct link to household wealth and insecurity. So the sources looked at Federal Reserve data, and the connection they found between having contact with the criminal justice system and a household's wealth is, well, it's brutal.
It really is. Households affected by incarceration, meaning someone in the family is currently or was previously incarcerated, have, on average, about 50% less wealth, half the wealth of unaffected households.
Let's dig into those numbers because they reveal the mechanism. Affected households had median assets around $54,800.
Okay, compared to unaffected households at $282,700. That's a massive gap.
But here's the kicker, the really revealing part. Their debt levels.
Right. The debt levels were almost the same. About $25,000 for affected households versus $25,900 for unaffected ones.
Wait, that's critical. So their borrowing needs are similar, but their assets are 5 times lower.
Exactly. It strongly suggests that the debt affected households do manage to take on is often crisis debt, to cover rent, medical bills, maybe those court fees we just talked about.
Not the kind of debt that builds wealth like a mortgage for a house.
Precisely. It's not productive investment debt. This shows the system isn't just penalizing past actions. It's actively, structurally preventing these families from ever building wealth, from getting ahead.
It's a systemic barrier to building wealth, not just an income problem.
And the data backs this up, showing pervasive financial insecurity. In 2019, look at legal debt owed directly to the courts or legal system. 21.5% of affected households had it.
Compared to what for unaffected households?
Just 2.1%, almost negligible. And financial fragility. Over 22% of affected households couldn't afford to pay all their bills that year.
Versus about 14.5% for unaffected households.
So it's a significant difference. And this fragility spirals outwards, blocking attempts to climb up. If you try to use the system, apply for a loan for a car, a small business, maybe education.
The financial instability plus the record itself just works against you.
Absolutely. In 2019, nearly a quarter, 23.4% of affected households were denied a loan. That's more than double the rate for unaffected households, which was around 11.2%.
And this constant financial stress means they have no buffer. Barely half, 49% of affected households could handle a sudden $400 emergency using cash.
Compared to two-thirds, 67.2% of unaffected households, that lack of a safety net, that inability to absorb shocks guarantees long-term precarity. Hashtag 1.3 exacerbation of the racial wealth gap.
And the analysis makes it absolutely clear that this whole system doesn't just correlate with the U.S. racial wealth gap, it actively makes it worse.
Aggressively exacerbates it, is how I'd put it, because of long-standing systemic disparities in who gets policed, who gets arrested, how sentencing works. The economic consequences of having a criminal record fall disproportionately on families of color,
leading to a much steeper drop in their capital and their wealth.
The median wealth figures are just devastating. For Black households with an incarcerated family member, median wealth in 2019 was $11,101 moles.
$1,100. That's essentially zero wealth. It leaves families completely exposed.
Hispanic households weren't much better off, but compare that to white households who also had an incarcerated family member. Their median wealth was $15,330. Still impacted, clearly, but vastly different.
So the system actively strips capital away, and it does so unevenly based on race.
It's so significant that when researchers build statistical models to understand what drives household wealth differences, they attribute about 20% of the gap between Black and white households directly to these criminal justice interactions.
20%.
And even more starkly, 40% of the gap between Hispanic and white households, it's traced back to the justice system's impact.
So these families aren't just poor in the moment. Their actual structural ability to build wealth over generations is being systematically destroyed by the legal system.
Which means the policy response has to hit that exact point, the intersection of criminal justice and economics.
The sources talk about fair chance policies in hiring, housing, education.
Yes, and crucially, expanding access to automatic record clearing, often called clean slate laws. We need to actively remove these barriers that just linger forever.
And tackle the debt trap at its root.
Absolutely. Systemic debt reform. Those court-imposed fines and fees often block record clearing anyway. People can't get financially stable enough to save or invest if they're drowning in this debt. There's an estimated $27 billion in court debt nationally.
$27 billion.
So state and local governments have got to stop using fees and fines as, a primary way to fund themselves. There are bipartisan efforts starting, like the Fresh Start Act, proposing federal money to help states set up efficient automatic record clearance.
It's just hard to reconcile, isn't it? The stated goal is justice, order, but the outcome looks a lot like systemic chaos, entrenched poverty, and widening inequality.
It really feels like the ultimate modern example of that perverse effect we mentioned. A system designed ostensibly to punish crime ends up imposing permanent punishment on entire families, entire communities, long after any official sentence is over.
Okay, so that finding this idea that chasing order can actually deliver chaos It's not just a modern problem with the justice system.
Not at all. To really understand how deep this impulse runs, we need to look back, specifically at the historical search for large-scale efficiency during the Progressive Era.
Right. And see how that drive produced its own incredibly dark and perverse consequences. Hashtag 2.1, the foundations of progressive economic reform.
The Progressive Era reformers, they really marked a fundamental break from the ideas that came before classical liberalism, that Anglo-American individualism that was so core to the country's founding.
That older philosophy was all about individual self-reliance, natural rights, the market deciding things.
The Progressives, they rejected that pretty much wholesale. They adopted a much more organic, collectivist viewpoint. A lot of influence came from European economic thought, especially the German historical school.
Figures like Cooley and Ely.
Right. They started seeing the nation less as a collection of individuals with rights and more like an organism, something greater than the sum of its constituent individuals, as they put it.
And if the nation is an organism, that changes the whole point of governing, doesn't it?
Completely. The focus shifts away from individual liberty towards, well, centrally planned social control, all supposedly for the collective good. The state becomes the brain, tasked with optimizing the whole organism.
This was a radical shift. The sources mention the editors of the New Republic magazine around World War I.
Yeah, finding the U.S. Bill of Rights, the very bedrock of individual protection, to be quaint and even retrograde.
Quaint and retrograde, that's astonishing.
But it follows from their premise. They actually asked, rhetorically, what inalienable right has the individual against the community that made him and supports him?
And their answer was?
Essentially none.
Yeah.
The individual was subordinate. Subordinate to scientific expertise, subordinate to the planned efficiency dictated by the state.
And this new ideology just worshipped one concept above almost everything else: social efficiency.
They basically equated progress with efficiency, greater rationality, more scientific management. They had this almost religious faith in science, in expert managers, as the way to achieve this optimized society.
Which brings us to Frederick Winslow Taylor. Taylorism, scientific management.
Exactly. It started on the factory floor, optimizing workflows, but the progressives saw it as a blueprint for society itself. Taylor promised not just more output, but order, predictability, even fairness.
Fairness through science.
The idea was to replace the arbitrary whims of bosses with the impartial, objective application of science, led by the competent, the experts.
And the big thinkers of the era bought it completely. Louis Brandeis, later a Supreme Court justice, called Taylor a genius.
John R. Commons, a huge figure in economics, called Taylorism the most productive invention in the history of modern industry.
So the promise was social harmony, achieved through efficiency.
Pretty much. If you could just increase output so dramatically, the resulting surplus would be so huge that nobody would need to fight over how to divide it. They genuinely sought to scientifically eliminate politics, conflict, individual bargaining. Just perfect centralized management.
The system first, dictated by science. Humans second.
And here's where the really dark twist comes in. That same drive the pursuit of scientific control, ultimate social efficiency, which sounds so rational when you're talking about factories.
It led directly to the widespread embrace of eugenics, the absolute moral catastrophes of the 20th century.
And what's crucial to understand, based on the sources, is that this wasn't some philosophical accident. It wasn't a weird detour. It was seen as a complementary outgrowth.
How so?
Because the exact same intellectual commitments that drew progressives to massive economic and political engineering.
The rejection of individualism, the worship of efficiency, the belief in scientific experts.
Those same ideas naturally led them to eugenics. If the goal is to optimize the social organism, and science is the tool, then controlling human heredity seemed like the next logical step.
And eugenics wasn't some fringe idea back then.
Absolutely not. It was mainstream. It was presented as socially responsible, scientifically sound, embraced by leading geneticists, economists, scholars across the political spectrum in the West.
Sold as the objective, scientific way to improve the collective human stock.
Right. If you truly believe society should be centrally planned for the collective good, and that science holds the ultimate moral authority, eugenics almost becomes inevitable. It was framed as the most efficient, the most rational, even the most humane way to manage human heredity.
Better than messy, unpredictable natural selection. Let the experts decide what's best for the social good.
Exactly. Replacing subjective individual choice with objective expert determination. This shows the profound danger when you elevate centralized control and scientific management above individual rights.
There's a quote from Sidney Webb, the Fabian socialist.
Yes, it perfectly captures that technocratic ideal, that belief in central planning. He said explicitly, no consistent eugenicist can be a laissez-faire individualist. He must interfere, interfere, interfere.
Interfere, interfere, interfere. That says it all.
It really does. It reveals the total subordination of individual liberty. The progressive movement, in its intense desire to create this perfectly efficient, orderly society, ironically championed a policy of centralized social control that caused immense lasting harm.
Proving, perhaps, that the quest for ultimate efficiency might be the most perverse intention of all.
Okay, so using that historical backdrop helps frame these systemic failures. Let's just solidify the analytical tools we're using here. Two key frameworks, one economic, one rhetorical. Hashtag Technic 3.1, creative destruction versus destructive creation.
Most people have probably heard of Schumpeter's idea, creative destruction.
Right. The idea that capitalism constantly churns, innovation replaces old ways, it can be painful, like the carriage industry dying out.
But the new thing, the automobile industry, creates a net productive gain for society overall.
Exactly. But our sources introduce the flip side, the negative counterpart, destructive creation.
Destructive creation. So what is that?
It's when an innovation or some systemic change actually results in a net negative outcome for society and the economy, even if it creates huge profits for the person or company that originated it.
So what makes creation turn destructive? It's not just about job losses.
It's more complex. It often involves massive externalized costs.
How?
Things like premature obsolescence, forcing everyone into wasteful replacement cycles, or significantly, the huge disruption of existing jobs and investments. We'll see that with deindustrialization later.
And unforeseen consequences like environmental damage or health impacts.
Precisely. Costs that society as a whole ends up having to bear down the line.
The sources give the 2007-2009 financial crisis as a prime example.
A perfect, devastating example. Financial innovations like complex derivatives, those structured investment products, exotic mortgages, they were initially sold as ways to spread risk.
But instead, they ended up hiding risk. Massively.
Resulting in trillions of dollars in global economic damage, millions losing jobs, homes. That's destructive creation on a grand scale. The innovation caused systemic harm, not progress.
There's a smaller example too, right? The coffee pods.
Yeah, the single-serving coffee pod offers, a tiny bit of convenience, quick, easy coffee.
But the sources point out that their sheer ubiquity has created an enormous increase in waste. Millions of these little plastic and foil things, often non-recyclable, tossed out every single day.
Even the inventor apparently expressed regret later on. It's a clear net negative for the environment, traded for very minor personal convenience.
So the key here is who benefits versus who pays the cost.
That's absolutely vital. Destructive creation often happens because the gains are captured privately by the investors, the inventors, maybe the users. But at least some, often many, of the costs are externalized.
Dumped onto society. Environmental cleanup, financial bailouts, unemployment support.
Exactly. So unless we find ways to measure and account for those full social costs, including the externalities, it's very hard to stop this pattern of systemic failure. Hashtag TACHTAG 3.2, the rhetoric of the perverse effect.
Okay, now the rhetorical tool. This concept that often comes up when we talk about reforms going wrong, the perversity thesis.
Right. This is a really powerful, almost knee-jerk argument you hear when a well-intentioned policy seems to blow up in everyone's face.
So the perverse effect basically argues that trying to push society in one direction
will actually make it move in the exact opposite direction. Whatever you were trying to fix, you end up making worse.
Why is that such a compelling argument?
Yeah.
Especially maybe for critics or those out of power.
Well, a few reasons. It's simple to grasp. It's intriguing, this idea of unintended consequences gone wild. And rhetorically, it's devastating.
How so?
Because it allows the critic to sound reasonable. They can say, oh, yes, of course I support the goal, liberty, helping the poor, whatever it is. They endorse the moral objective.
But then they argue the method is totally wrong.
Exactly. They argue the action taken is so ill-conceived, it's actually self-defeating. It gives them a kind of moral high ground while still launching a full-blown attack on the policy.
We've seen this throughout history, haven't we? The French Revolution example.
A classic case. Critics argued fiercely that striving for radical liberty and rights didn't lead to freedom, it led straight to the reign of terror. Barbarism and servitude, as Schiller put it, the outcome was the perverse opposite of the intent.
And you see the same pattern centuries later with critiques of the welfare state.
The exact same rhetorical structure. Think about Charles Murray's arguments in the 80s. He'd say, yes, we want to help the poor, but argue that the welfare system, by providing more aid, ironically created more poverty by trapping people in dependency.
Which sounds a lot like the arguments against the Old English poor laws back in the 19th century, that giving aid just created paupers instead of relieving poverty.
It's the same logic. The core insight, the goal of this rhetoric, is to prove that the well-meaning reformer, the German term is Weltverbesserer, the world improver.
Is actually a Weltverschlechterer, a world worsener.
Precisely. And crucially, you have to show the worsening happens exactly along the dimension where the improvement was intended. It's a clever intellectual move, endorse the ideal, then demolish the method. Understanding this rhetoric really helps frame the failures we already discussed and the ones we're about to get into.
All right, let's transition now from the theory and history to look at two huge current systems that seem to be under profound stress: the very foundation of American political structure and the ongoing crisis in global trade.
And both, arguably, demonstrate spectacular, long-lasting, perverse effects. Hashtag 4.1, unintended consequences in U.S. political structure, the Electoral College.
First, the way the U.S. president is selected, the Electoral College. This feels like a textbook example of a system built for one reality, creating huge problems in another.
Absolutely. It's a mechanism born from compromises made in the late 18th century. Needs that simply don't exist anymore primarily, appeasing slave-owning states and giving disproportionate power to states with smaller populations.
And the analysis of the founding makes it pretty clear, doesn't it? It only got through the Constitutional Convention because of the 3/5 compromise, counting enslaved people for representation, but not really.
Right. The sources explicitly point out that without those electors based on the enslaved population boosting the South's count, Thomas Jefferson wouldn't have beaten John Adams in that critical 1800 election.
So the original justifications, managing slave power dynamics, dealing with slow communication, balancing state sovereignty versus national power, they're all gone. But the system remains, and arguably, it actively undermines democratic function today.
We can really pinpoint 5 major unintended harms the Electoral College causes in our modern, polarized, highly connected democracy.
Okay, number one.
The risk of the popular vote loser. This is probably the most damaging to public trust. In any reasonably close election, say, the popular vote margin is under 3%. The chances of the person with fewer individual votes winning the presidency is roughly 3 in 10.
3 in 10. That's a significant structural risk to the basic idea of democratic fairness.
Hugely significant. Second is the infamous battleground state phenomenon, because most states use a winner-take-all system for their electors.
Campaigns pour almost all their time, money, and attention into just a handful of swing states where the outcome might be close.
Exactly. Look at 2016 data. 94% of all presidential campaign events happened in just 12 states.
94%. And what about the biggest states? California, New York, Texas.
Barely saw them. Together, those 3 states got only 0.5%, 0.5% of campaign visits. Millions upon millions of voters are essentially ignored because their state's outcome is seen as predictable.
Third harm. This translates directly into unequal policy benefits, right?
It certainly seems to. Presidents inevitably take office knowing much more about and often feeling more obligated to the specific concerns of those few states that decided the election.
The sources mention Medicare Part D being passed after the 2000 election, which heavily focused on Florida and Pennsylvania, states with lots of seniors.
Right. Or, more recently, critics point to the difference in federal hurricane relief. Robust, prompt aid often goes to key electoral states like Florida, while territories like Puerto Rico, whose residents are U.S. citizens but have no electoral votes, seem to experience much slower, more limited responses.
Okay, fourth harm.
Disempowerment of demographics. If a particular group, ethnic, religious, economic, happens to be concentrated outside those crucial battleground states, their political clout just evaporates.
The example given is Mormon voters.
Yes, heavily concentrated in states like Utah, Idaho, states that reliably vote Republican, making them non-competitive in presidential races. So their relative voter power is calculated as incredibly low, just 0.12 compared to the national average of 1.00.
Yeah.
Geography basically disenfranchises them at the presidential level.
And the fifth harm sounds particularly worrying today. Vulnerability to election interference.
It really is, because the whole election hinges on just a few states, adversaries, foreign governments. Non-state actors don't need to try and influence the entire country.
They can focus their efforts, disinformation, hacking, whatever, on a very small number of places and potentially tip the whole result.
And the margins in recent close elections are Terrifyingly small. Just a few hundred votes in Florida in 2000, maybe 80,000 votes spread across 3 states in 2016. That kind of concentrated vulnerability makes the system a prime target.
So fixing it via constitutional amendment seems like a non-starter politically. The 1979 attempt for direct election failed badly.
Yeah, got only 51 Senate votes. Extremely difficult threshold. So the sources suggest the most viable path right now is the Interstate Compact.
Explain that again.
It's an agreement among states. States representing a majority of electoral votes, 270, agree ahead of time to award all their electors to whoever wins the national popular vote, regardless of who won in their specific state.
So it effectively achieves a national popular vote outcome without needing to amend the Constitution.
Clever. It's seen as the most promising route, though it still faces political hurdles.
Okay, let's shift gears from political structure to our economic foundation. Another huge, persistent imbalance. The massive U.S. trade deficit.
And the analysis we looked at argues this isn't just some random thing that happens in global trade. It's a direct result of deep problems within the U.S. economy. Specifically, really low domestic savings combined with high overall investment.
Meaning, we don't save enough ourselves to fund our own investments, so we have to borrow from other countries to make up the difference.
Precisely. The trade deficit becomes the mirror image of that borrowing. The intertemporal trade model frames it really well. It's like American society collectively is borrowing from the future. We consume way more than we produce here at home.
And the really damaging part, according to the sources, is what we do with that borrowed money, those foreign inflows.
Yeah, the credit we get from countries selling us stuff, instead of using it primarily to reinvest in our own factories, our own productive capacity, which has a big multiplier effect, maybe 3 to 1.
We mostly use it to just buy more stuff, support consumption.
Right, so we end up borrowing money to fuel the production capacity of other countries while our own declines.
And the cost of that pattern, that unchecked debt-fueled globalization, is stark. Since 2000, the U.S. has lost almost 70,000 factories.
70,000. And over 5 million manufacturing jobs gone with them.
You look at manufacturing as a share of the whole U.S. economy, the GDP, is plummeted from around 28% back in 1959.
Down to just 10.3% today, a massive structural shift.
And you see the human cost, the social cost, in places left behind by this.
Yeah.
The sources mention Gary, Indiana, Youngstown, Ohio,
Yeah.
these former industrial hubs.
Yeah, the ghosts of deindustrialization. Poverty rates over 30%, 15% respectively. Astronomical violent crime rates. It's not just an economic shift, it's the complete unraveling of the social fabric in many communities.
And this hollowing out, this reliance on imports, became a huge vulnerability during the pandemic, didn't it?
A critical national security threat laid bare. The analysis showed that just before COVID hit, in 2019, the U.S. imported 47% of all its medical goods.
Almost half.
And for active pharmaceutical ingredients, the core components of medicines, it was 80%. 80% reliant on imports.
So when global supply chains seized up,
We saw critical shortages of basic essential things like N95 masks. The perverse effect here is crystal clear. The relentless pursuit of cheaper goods, of corporate efficiency through offshoring, led directly to profound national insecurity.
okay, so in response to this deep hole we've dug, recent policy has often turned to things like high tariffs.
Right. And the argument from supporters isn't necessarily that tariffs are good in themselves, but that they're a tool, a negotiation tactic.
Aimed at correcting those trade imbalances, forcing fairer practices,
Yeah.
and maybe kickstarting some domestic reindustrialization.
Exactly. It's framed as a strategic pivot, trying to shift away from that debt-driven consumption economy we just described towards rebuilding the supply side, making things here again.
Now, one of the big criticisms you always hear is inflation. Tariffs mean higher prices for consumers.
That was the standard prediction from many economists when tariffs were imposed in 2018, 2019. They expected immediate runaway inflation.
But the data didn't really bear that out.
Largely, no. The analysis suggests the core reason was that foreign exporters, the companies selling goods to the U.S., actually absorbed a huge chunk of the tariff costs themselves, up to 75% in some cases.
Why would they do that?
Because access to the massive U.S. consumer market is incredibly valuable. They chose to cut their profit margins rather than risk losing that access by passing the full tariff cost onto American buyers.
So like a 19% tariff might only translate to a 1% or 2% price increase here.
Something like that, yeah. The burden fell mostly on the exporter, not the U.S. consumer, contrary to predictions. And the argument now is that with current conditions, weaker consumer demand, high debt, low savings, it's even harder for companies to pass on costs. So even expanded tariffs might not spark major inflation today.
This whole approach sounds less like traditional economics and more like
Yeah.
strategy, game theory.
That's exactly how supporters frame it. They see modern trade policy, especially using abrupt plets and high tariffs, through the lens of game theory models. Things like the ultimatum game or strategic chaos, like Thomas Schelling wrote about.
Okay, unpack the ultimatum game aspect.
So in that game, one player, let's say the U.S., makes a non-negotiable take-it-or-leave-it offer, and it's backed by a credible, severe threat.
Like threatening 50% tariffs on imports from a country unless they change certain practices.
Precisely. The other player, the trading partner, has to basically accept the new terms or face potentially catastrophic exclusion from the U.S. market.
And how does the chicken game scenario fit in?
That's about brinkmanship. Two players heading towards a collision, the first one to swerve is seen as losing face or losing the game. By using strategic chaos being unpredictable, making bold threats, the idea is to convince your opponent that you are not going to swerve.
Forcing them to change course, to play by rules more favorable to the U.S.
Right. Forcing concessions on things like intellectual property theft, unfair subsidies, market access barriers. Supporters see it as a necessary, even if confrontational, zero-sum game.
Zero-sum, meaning the U.S. wins, and the exporting countries collectively have to accept less favorable terms.
That's the underlying logic, yes. That the U.S. needs to use its market power to force a rebalancing. And the long-term goal, they argue, has to be reindustrialization. Bringing production back, reshoring, or moving it closer to home, nearshoring.
For national security, reducing geopolitical risks.
Absolutely. And they point to examples already happening, like Intel building huge new chip fabs in Ohio, or data showing hundreds of thousands of manufacturing jobs returning to the U.S. in recent years as evidence the strategy can work. #HackOutro. So we've covered a lot of ground today. We started with the devastating impact of the legal system, how it systematically strips wealth and deepens racial divides.
Then we went back in time, looked at the progressive era's obsession with scientific efficiency, and how that impulse, aiming for control, ironically led straight to the horrors of eugenics.
And finally, we explored the really high-stakes game of modern trade policy, this attempt to reverse decades of deindustrialization that arguably weakened the country.
And the pattern that just keeps emerging, the really troubling thread through all of it, is how often policies backfire. Whether they start from noble goals like justice or the cold logic of efficiency, or just messy political compromise.
They frequently end up creating their own huge unintended systemic crises. It's that perverse effect playing out again and again across different American institutions.
We began by asking how these failed policies strip wealth and widen inequality. And I think what really stands out is that these aren't just isolated mistakes.
No, they feel like deep systemic consequences. Consequences of designing systems without fully grappling with how complex social and economic forces can twist intentions, how they naturally tend to produce results opposite to what was planned.
So the critical question we want to lead you, the listener, with is this. If we know this happens, if we know the search for perfect order often breeds chaos, and the drive for efficiency can create terrible fragility, how do we actually design institutions differently?
How do we build systems that anticipate these perverse effects, that have built-in mechanisms to mitigate them before they lock in the next crisis? How do we make systems resilient even against the best intentions of the world improvers, the Weltverbesserer?
That feels like the real challenge moving forward. If you found this deep dive valuable, if it gave you something to think about, we definitely encourage you to subscribe, like this discussion, and please comment with your own thoughts on these really complex issues.
Thank you for listening to VSOW.